Hey guys, my name is Elijah and I would like to show you how to configure Ubuntu server on Microsoft Azure. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to access our server using SSH, and also we will configure a desktop environment on that server. Before we dive into action, these are the things we're going to first do. First, we are going to create an Azure account. 2, we'll configure and deploy a virtual machine with a Ubuntu server. 3, we shall configure some firewall rules for RDP, remote desktop protocol, SSH, and NoMachine. And then we will configure SSH access, install NoMachine server on Ubuntu, and also install desktop environment. In this case, we're going to use Genome and configure it. So, what do you need to create an Azure account? Creating an Azure account is free. You don't need to pay money to create an Azure account. All you need is an email account. It could be an Outlook account, it could be a Gmail account, it could be a Yahoo account, it could be any email service provider. So you need an email account. You also need a phone number. That phone number, you must be having it on your phone, because you'll be required to verify it. They will send you a code, and then you get that code to verify your Azure account. And finally, you also need a credit card for your billing information. Remember, this credit card is very important, and without it you cannot proceed with your account. For you to be able to access Azure account, you must have a credit card. It could be a Visa card, it could be a MasterCard. So you must have a credit card or a debit card so that you are able to get access to your account. Now, when you sign up for Azure account, you get access to a free 200 Azure free credit. They give you free credit for about $200. So this credit, once you sign up for the first time, you can use the credit to buy any Azure service you want. You can use it to buy any Azure service you want. It could be for database, load balancing, it could be private IP, anything. However, it is important to note that this $200 credit can only last for only 30 days. Once you sign up for the account and then you activate the $200 credit, it will only last for only 30 days. That is only 1 month. Now, configuring a Ubuntu virtual machine is just like any other computer. It is just an emulation of a computer, a physical computer. A Ubuntu virtual machine on Azure is an emulation. It's an emulation of a physical computer. So this means that you must configure RAM, you must configure CPU, you must configure disk storage. RAM is random access memory, and the CPU is the processing power of a computer. So the disk storage, it could be either HDD or SSD. It is also important to remember that the amount of computing resources you choose can determine the cost you incur. But if you are just a new beginner in this tutorial, we are focusing on using the 200 credit they are going to give us, the $200 credit they are going to give us. So in the future, after you've depleted your $200 credit on your Azure account, it is important that you be cautious on the type of resources, the computing resources you configure with your virtual machine. When you configure powerful computing resources like much RAM and powerful processors and much storage, which you probably don't need, it's likely to shoot up the cost very fast and deplete your wallet. Now, since a virtual machine on Azure is just an emulation of a physical computer, a physical server, this means networking is also important. So just like any computer, an Azure VM or virtual machine is also assigned an IP address. This IP address is very important for internet access, internet working, SSH access, and remote desktop access. You can either choose static IP address or dynamic IP address. Azure automatically assigns you a dynamic IP address on your virtual machine. This dynamic IP address means that when you stop your virtual machine and then again restart it after some time, the IP address they assigned you in the initial stage or initially is not going to remain the same. They will generate a new IP address. So it is important that if you just want to have one IP address for use, you may need to have a static IP address. A static IP address it doesn't change. It doesn't change. It remains the same even if you switch off your machine and then power it on again. So the difference between a static IP address and a dynamic IP address is that static IP addresses don't change, but those static IP addresses are just reserved. You just ask them. I think you pay some money for to assign your static IP addresses. A dynamic IP address is free of charge. Azure gives you a dynamic IP address for free, and when you sign up for an account and you fire up a virtual machine, Azure will automatically assign you with a dynamic IP address until you ask, you reserve that IP address to be static if you want. Now, security is very important. Servers are accessed over a network, so it is important to maintain security at whichever cost. Security is something that we cannot compromise on a server, so it is important that when you fire up a Ubuntu server on Azure, you configure it with hardened security. To secure your instance, you may need to set up a root password, but most preferably using SSH key is highly recommended for secure remote access. In the enterprise setting or in production environment, you may need to set up what we call SSH key, and that is more secure than using a password if you're going to use SSH access. You can also configure firewall configurations. We have to allow only necessary traffic to your server. You can allow only necessary traffic to your server. And in this tutorial, we will configure firewall rules for RDP, NoMachine, and SSH. Now, remote access is very important in the server. As you know, Azure is an infrastructure as a service, so it has different data centers that are spread all over the world. So whatever we access on Azure is somewhere in the data center. So when you access Azure remotely, you are practically you are using remote technology to access Azure servers that are located somewhere in the data center. So since we are going to rely on remote access, we are going to use SSH to remotely log into our server. We can also install remote desktop protocols like the popular RDP, or even set up the NXP protocol for NoMachine. These protocols, we can use RDP and configure it on our server, and then use the remote desktop access client for Windows to be able to access the graphical user interface of our server. Most preferably, we are going to use NXP protocol for NoMachine. NoMachine is much more faster than the native Windows remote desktop client. It offers minimal latency when accessing a remote server, especially the graphic user interface. Now, so configuring SSH, you need to have an SSH client installed on your computer to be able to remotely log into your server. SSH stands for Secure Shell, which is a TCP protocol for accessing remote machines. On Windows, you can download and use PuTTY or PuTTY SSH client, or the newer versions of Windows come with SSH client features, but you just have to download it. On Linux systems and Mac OS, they usually have SSH client features, so you don't need to download it. So the SSH syntax, regardless of the system you're going to use, is just SSH and the IP address for the server. In this case, the Ubuntu server we plan to deploy on Microsoft Azure. So before we continue with configuring our server on Azure, we have to also understand what a desktop environment means. A desktop environment provides you with a graphical user interface for your remote server. You are able to access icons, toolbars, and desktop widgets. It's just like any graphical user interface for any Linux machine. Cloud servers don't usually come with graphical user interfaces, and so we have to install it. Common graphical user interfaces for Linux include GNOME, MED, XFCE, and many others. Now, in this tutorial, our main focus to be able to access the graphical user interface, we are going to use the NoMachine. NoMachine uses a proprietary NXP protocol to enable you remotely access your server's graphical user interface. So you have to install a NoMachine server on Ubuntu machine, and then download a NoMachine client on your computer, and you're good to go. NoMachine also uses TCP ports to be accessed via the internet.